I'm going to read a bit of Stephen King fairy tale. It's something I've never read before. I've just had a brief listen to the audiobook, and to be honest, I was actually really impressed. Sometimes I hear audiobooks and I think, not sure I'd have gone with that narrator. It's just personal preferences. This one I was actually really impressed. So I'm going to show a brief part of the official audiobook, and then I'll read the first chapter or so. Yeah.
Chapter 1. The Goddamn Bridge. The Miracle. The Howling. 1. I'm sure I can tell this story. I'm also sure no one will believe it. That's fine with me. Telling it will be enough. My problem, and I'm sure many writers have it, not just newbies like me, is deciding where to start. My first thought was with the shed, because that's where my adventures really began, but then I realized I would have to tell about Mr. Bowditch first.
My God, this guy's good. This guy's good. I like that. I like his voice. Some people just don't have it, and this guy, my God, yeah, I'm really impressed with that. I'm going to check out some of his other audiobooks because I like his vocal. He's very controlled, very clear, no weird mannerisms. I find some people have some really weird, like wet lip thing going on, which I find really uncomfortable. So you're trying to listen, and when you've got headphones on, more voices, of course, are all your mannerisms are far more pronounced when you've got a headset. He's very controlled. I'm like proper ace. Very impressed. So I'm going to do my side now. So, chapter 1, The Goddamn Bridge, The Miracle, The Howling. I'm sure I can tell this story. I'm also sure no one will believe it. That's fine with me. Telling it will be enough. My problem, and I'm sure many writers have it, not just newbies like me, is deciding where to start. My first thought was with the shed, because that's where my adventures really began. But then I realized I would have to tell about Mr. Bowditch first, and how we became close. Only that never would have happened except for the miracle that happened to my father. A very ordinary miracle, you could say. One that's happened to many thousands of men and women since 1935. But it seemed like a miracle to a kid. Only that it isn't the right place either, because I don't think my father would have needed a miracle if it hadn't been for that goddamn bridge. So that's where I need to start, with the goddamn Sycamore Street Bridge. And now, thinking of those things, I see a clear thread leading up through the years to Mr. Bowditch, and the padlocked shed behind the ramshackle old Victorian. But a thread is easy to break. So not a thread, but a chain, a strong one. And I was the kid with the shackle clamped around his wrist. Chapter 2. The little Rumpel River runs through the north end of Sentry's Rest, known to the locals as Sentry. And until the year 1996, the year I was born, it was spanned by a wooden bridge. That was the year the state inspectors from the Department of Highway Transportation looked it over and deemed it unsafe. People in our part of Sentry had known that since '82, my father said. The bridge was posted for £10,000, but townies with a full loaded pickup truck mostly steered clear of it, opting for the turnpike extension, which was an annoying and time-consuming detour. My dad said you could feel the planks shiver and shake and rumble under you even in a car. It was dangerous. The state inspectors were right about that. But here's the irony. If the old wooden bridge had never been replaced by one made of steel, my mother might still be alive. The little Rumpel really is little, and putting up the new bridge didn't take long. The wooden span was demolished, and the new one was open to traffic in April of '97. The mayor cut a ribbon. Father Coughlin blessed the goddamn thing. And that was that, my father said one night. He was pretty drunk at the time. Wasn't much a blessing for us, Charlie, was it? It was named the Frank Ellsworth Bridge, after a hometown hero who died in Vietnam. But the locals just called it the Sycamore Street Bridge. Sycamore Street was paved nice and smooth on both sides. But the bridge deck, 142 feet long, was still grating that made a humming sound when cars went over it, and a rumble when trucks used it, which they could do because the bridge was now rated at £60,000. Not big enough for a loaded semi, but long haulers never used Sycamore Street anyway. There was talk every year in the town council about paving the deck and adding at least one sidewalk. But every year it seemed like there was other places where the money was needed more urgently. I don't think a sidewalk would have saved my mother, but paving might have. There's no way to know, is there? That goddamn bridge. Chapter 3. We lived halfway up the long length of Sycamore Street Hill, about a quarter of a mile from the bridge. There was a little gas and convenience store on the other side, called Zip Mart. It sold all the usual stuff from motor oil to Wonder Bread to Little Debbie cakes. But it also sold fried chicken made by the proprietor, Mr. Elides, known to the neighbourhood as Mr. Zippy. That chicken was exactly what the sign in the window said. The best in the land. I can still remember how tasty it was, but I never ate a single piece after my mum died. I would have gagged it up if I tried. One Saturday in November of 2003, the town council still discussing paving the bridge. Still deciding it could wait another year. My mother told us she was going to walk down to the Zippy, get us fried chicken for dinner. My father and I were watching a college football game. You should take the car, Dad said. It's going to rain. I need the exercise, Mum said, but I'll wear my little Red Riding Hood raincoat. And that's what she was wearing the last time I saw her. The hood wasn't up because it wasn't raining yet, so her hair was spilling over her shoulders. I was 7 years old and thought my mother had the world's most beautiful red hair. She saw me looking at her through the window and waved. I waved back, then turned my attention to the TV, where LSU was driving. I wish I had looked longer, but I don't blame myself. You never know where the trapdoors are in your life, do you? It wasn't my fault and it wasn't my dad's fault, although I know he blamed himself. Or, if only I'd gotten up off my dead ass and given her a ride to the damn store. It probably wasn't the fault of the man in the plumbing truck either. The cop said he was sober, and he swore he was keeping to the speed limit, which was 25 in our residential zone. Dad said that even if that was true, the man must have taken his eyes off the road, if only for a few seconds. Dad was probably right about that. He was an insurance claims adjuster. And he told me once, the only pure accident he ever heard of was a man in Arizona who was killed when a meteor hit him in the head. There's always someone at fault, Dad said, which is not the same as blame. Do you blame the man who hit Mum? I asked. He thought about it, raised his glass to his lips and drank. This was 6 or 8 months after Mum died, and he'd pretty much given up on beer. By then he was strictly a Gilbey's man. I try not to, and mostly I can do that unless I wake up at 2 in the morning with nobody in the bed but me. Then I blame him. Mum walked down the hill. There was a sign where the sidewalk ended. She walked past the sign and crossed the bridge. By then it was getting dark and starting to drizzle. She went into the store, and Irina Elides, of course known as Mrs. Zippy, told her more chicken was coming out in 3 minutes. 5 at the most. Somewhere on Pine Street, not far from our house, the plumber had just finished his last job of that Saturday and was putting his toolbox in the back of his panel van. The chicken came out, hot and crispy and golden. Mrs. Zippy boxed up an 8-piece and gave Mum an extra wing to eat on her walk home. Mum thanked her, paid, and stopped to look at the magazine rack. If she hadn't done that, she might have made it all the way across the bridge. Who knows? The plumber's van must have been turning onto Sycamore Street and starting down the mile-long hill, while Mum was checking out the latest issue of People. She put it back, opened the door, and spoke to Mrs. Zippy over her shoulder. "Have a nice night." She might have cried out when she saw the van was going to hit her. And God knows what she might have been thinking. But those were the last words she ever spoke. She went out. The rain was coming down, cold and steady by then. Silvery lines in the glow of the one streetlight on the Zip Mart side of the bridge, munching on her chicken wing. My mother walked onto the steel deck. Headlights picked her out and threw her shadow long behind her. The plumber passed the sign on the other side, the one that reads, "Bridge surface freezes before road. Please use caution." Was he looking in his rearview mirror? Maybe checking for messages on his phone? He said no to both. But when I think of what happened to her that night, I always think of my dad saying the only pure accident he ever heard was the man who took a meteor to the head. There was plenty of room. The steel bridge was quite a bit wider than the wooden version had been. The problem was that the steel grating. He saw my mother halfway across the bridge and hit the brake, not because he was speeding, or so he said, but out of pure instinct. The steel surface had started to freeze. The panel truck skidded and slewed, started to go sideways. My mother shrank against the bridge rail, dropping her little piece of chicken. The panel truck slewed further, struck her, and sent her spinning along the rail like a top. I don't want to think about the parts of her that were torn off in that death spin, but I'm helpless not to sometimes. All I know is that the nose of the panel truck finally drove her into a bridge stanchion near the Zip Mart side of the bridge. Part of her went into the little rumple. Most of her stayed on the bridge. I carry a picture of us in my wallet. I was maybe 3 when it was taken. She got me on her hip. One of my hands is in her hair. She had beautiful hair. Chapter 5. Shitty Christmas that year. You better believe it. I remember the reception after the funeral. It was at our house. My father was there greeting people and accepting condolences, and then he was gone. I asked his brother, my Uncle Bob, where he was. "He had to lie down," Uncle Bob said. "He was really worn out, Charlie. Why don't you go outside and play?" I'd never felt less like playing in my life. But I went outside. I passed a bunch of grown-ups who had come outside to smoke and heard one of them say, "Poor guy, drunk as a skunk." Even then, deep in grief for my mother, I knew who they were talking about. Before Mum died, my father was what I'd call a regular drinker. I was just a little kid in the school grade, so I suppose you have to take that with a grain of salt, but I stand by it. I never heard him slurring. He didn't stumble around the place. He didn't go out to bars, and he never laid a hand on me or my mother. He would come home with his briefcase, and Mum would give him a drink, usually a martini. She'd have one too. In the evening, while we were watching TV, he might have a couple of beers. That was it. All that changed after the goddamn bridge. He was drunk after the funeral, as a skunk. Drunk on Christmas, and drunk on New Year's Eve, which I found out later people like him call amateur night. In the weeks and months after we lost her, he was drunk most of the time. Mostly at home. He still didn't go out to bars at night. "Too many arseholes like me," he said once. And he still never laid a hand on me. But the booze was out of control. I know that now. Then I just accepted it. Kids do that. Dogs too. I found myself getting my own breakfast 2 mornings a week. Then 4. Then almost all the time. I'd eat Alpha Bits or Apple Jacks in the kitchen and hear him snoring in the bedroom. great big motorboat snores. Sometimes he forgot to shave before leaving for work. After dinner, more and more that was takeout. I'd hide his car keys. If he needed a fresh bottle, he could walk down to the Zippy and get one. Sometimes I worried about him meeting a car on the goddamn bridge. But not too much. I was sure, pretty sure at least, that both my parents couldn't possibly get wiped out in the same place. My dad worked in insurance, and I knew what actual tables were, figuring the odds. He was good at his job, my dad, and he skated along for over 3 years in spite of his boozing. Did he get warnings at work? I don't know, but probably. Was he pulled over for driving erratically once the drinking started in the afternoon? If he was, maybe he was let off with a warning. Make that probably, because he knew all the cops in town. Dealing with cops was part of his job. There was a rhythm to our lives during those 3 years. Maybe not a good rhythm, not the sort you'd want to dance to, but one I could count on. I'd get home from school around 3. My father would roll around 5 with a few drinks already under his belt and on his breath. He didn't go out to the bars at night, but I found out later he was a regular at Duffy's Tavern on his way home from the office. He'd bring a pizza or tacos or Chinese from Joy Fun. Some nights he'd forget and we'd order out, or rather, I would. And after dinner, the real drinking would start, mostly gin. Other stuff if the gin was gone. Some nights he fell asleep in front of the TV. Some nights he'd stumble into the bedroom, leaving his shoes and rumpled suit coat for me to put away. Once in a while, I'd wake up and hear him crying. It's pretty awful to hear that in the middle of the night. The crash came in 2006. It was summer vacation. I had a shrimp league game at 10 in the morning, hit 2 home runs and made an awesome catch. I came home just after noon and found my father already there, sitting in his chair and staring at the TV, where old-time movie stars were having a duel on some castle stairs. He was in his undershorts and sipping a white drink that smelled to me like straight Gilbeys. I asked him what he was doing home. Still looking at the sword fight and hardly slurring at all, he said, "I seem to have lost my job, Charlie." Or if I can quote Bobcat Goldthorpe, "I know where it is, but someone else is doing it, or soon will be." I thought I didn't know what to say, but words came out of my mouth anyway. "Because if you're drinking." "I'm going to stop," he said. I just pointed at the glass. Then I went into my bedroom and shut the door and started to cry. He knocked on my door. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer. I didn't want him to hear me blubbing. "Come on, Charlie. I poured it down the sink." Like I didn't know the rest of the bottle would be on the kitchen counter, and another one in the liquor cabinet, or 2, or 3. "Come on, Charlie, what do you say?" I hated the slur in his voice. "Fuck you, Dad." I'd never said such a thing to him in my life, and I sort of wanted him to come in and give me a slap. Or a hug. Something anyway. Instead I heard him shuffle into the kitchen, where the bottle of Gilbey's would be waiting. He was asleep on the couch when I finally came out. The TV was still on, but muted. It was some other black and white movie, this one featuring old cars racing around, which was obviously a movie set. Dad always watched TCM when he was drinking, unless I was home and insisted on something else. The bottle was on the coffee table, mostly empty. I poured what was left down the sink. I opened the liquor cabinet and thought about pouring away everything else. But looking at the gin, the whiskey, the vodka nips, the coffee brandy, that just made me tired. You wouldn't think a 10-year-old could be tired like that, but I was. I put a Stouffer's frozen dinner in the microwave for supper. Grandma's chicken bake, our favourite. And shook him awake while it was cooking. He sat up, looked around like he didn't know where he was. He started to make these horrible chugging sounds I'd never heard before. He weaved his way to the bathroom with his hands over his mouth, and I heard him puking. It seemed to me like it would never stop, but eventually it did. The microwave binged. Binged. I got the chicken bake out using the oven mitts that said good cooking on the left and good eating on the right. You forgot to use those mitts once while you're taking something hot out of the zapper, and you never forgot again. I blopped some on our plates and then went into the living room where Dad was sitting on the couch with his head down and his hands laced together on the back of his neck. Can you eat? He looked up. Maybe, if you bring me a couple of aspirin. The bathroom stank of gin and something else. Maybe bean dip. But at least he'd gotten all of it in the bowl and flushed it away. I sprayed some Glade around and brought him the aspirin bottle and a glass of water. He took 3 and put the glass where the bottle of Gilbey's had been. He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, even after Mum died. I hate to say this, but I'm going to because it's what I thought then. It was the expression of a dog that has taken a shit on the floor. I could eat if you give me a hug. I hugged him and said I was sorry for what I said. It's okay. Probably I deserved it. We went into the kitchen and ate as much of Grandma's chicken bake as we could manage, which wasn't very much. As he scraped our plates into the sink, he told me he was going to stop drinking, and that weekend he did. He told me that on Monday he was going to start looking for a job, but he didn't. He stayed home, watched old movies on TCM, and when I came home from baseball practice and noon swim at the Y, he was pretty much blotto. He saw me looking at him and just shook his head. Tomorrow, absolutely, I promise. I call bullshit, I said, and went into my room. That was the worst summer of my childhood. Was it worse than after your mother died? You could ask, and I'd say yes, because he was the only parent I had left, and because it all seemed to be happening in slow motion. He did make a half-hearted effort at job hunting, the insurance biz, but nothing came of it, even when he shaved and bathed and dressed for success. Word gets around, I guess. The bills came in and piled up on the table in the front hall, unopened. By him, at least. I was the one who opened them when the stack got too high. I put them in front of him, and he wrote checks to cover them. I didn't know when the funds would start to bounce. Marked insufficient funds and didn't want to know. It was like standing on a bridge and imagining an out-of-control truck was skidding towards you, wondering what your last thoughts would be before it squashed you to death. He got a part-time job at the Jiffy Car Wash out by the Turnpike extension. That lasted a week. Then he either quit or got fired. He didn't tell me which, and I didn't ask. I made the All-Star Shrimp League team, but we knocked out in the first 2 games of a double elimination tournament. During the regular season, I had to hit 16 home runs. I was Star Market's best power hitter. But in those 2 games, I struck out 7 times. Once at a ball in the dirt, and once sucking for a pitch so far over my head, I would have needed an elevator to make contact. Coach asked what was wrong with me. I said nothing. Nothing. Just leave me alone. I was doing bad shit too. Some with a friend, some on my own, and not sleeping very well. I wasn't having nightmares like I did after Mother died. I just couldn't get to sleep. Sometimes, not until midnight, or 1 in the morning. I started turning my clock around so I wouldn't have to look at the numbers. I didn't exactly hate my father, although I'm sure I would have come to in time. But I felt contempt for him. Weak. I'd think lying in bed and listening to him snore. And of course I'd wonder what was going to happen to us. The car was paid for, which was good, but the house wasn't. And the size of those payments were horrifying to me. How long before he couldn't make the monthly nut? That time would surely come because the mortgage had another 9 years to run, and there was no way the money would hold out that long. Homeless, I thought. The bank will take the house, like in the Grapes of Wrath, and we'll be homeless. I'd seen homeless people downtown, plenty of them. And when I couldn't sleep, my mind turned to them. I thought about those urban wanderers at lot, wearing old clothes that bagged on their skinny bods or stretched on their corpulent ones. Sneakers held together with duct tape, crooked glasses, long hair, crazy eyes, boozy breath. I thought about us sleeping in our own car, down by the old train yards or in the Walmart parking lot among the RVs. I thought of my father pushing a shopping cart full of all we had left. I always saw my I always saw my bedside alarm clock in the basket. I don't know why that horrified me, but it did. Pretty soon I'd be going back to school, homeless or not. Some of the kids on my team would probably start calling me Strikeout Charlie, which would be better than Juice's Kid Charlie. But how long before that got into the mix? People on our street already knew that George Reade didn't go to work anymore, and they almost certainly knew why. I didn't kid myself about that. We were never a church-going family or religious at all in any conventional sense. Once I asked my mum why we didn't go to church. Was it because she didn't believe in God? She told me she did, but she didn't need a minister or a priest or a rabbi to tell her how to believe in him. She said she only needed to open her eyes and look around to do that. Dad said he was brought up a Baptist, but quit going when his church got more interested in politics than the Sermon on the Mount. One night, about a week before school was scheduled to start again, it came into my mind to pray. The urge was so strong it was really a compulsion. I got down on my knees beside my bed, folded my hands, squeezed my eyes shut, and prayed that my father would quit drinking. If you do that for me, whatever you are, whoever you are, I'll do something for you, I said. I promise, and hope to die if I don't keep it. You just show me what you want and I'll do it, I swear. Then I got back into bed that night at least. Slept through until morning. I'm really enjoying it. Like I said, the original narrator I think is incredible, just from that very beginning part that I heard. It's not easy for me to read this because of the lighting at the moment. It's a bit of a pain for me, so I'm having to sort of hold the book further forward, so hence why I'm struggling a little bit with some of it. It was just literally the practicality of holding it. When I read on the Kindle, for instance, so I've got it in paperback, but I find it's a lot easier to read off screen or from the Kindle, for instance. But yeah, listen to a little bit more just from the original.
And how we became close. Only that never would have happened except for the miracle that happened to my father. A very ordinary miracle, you could say, one that's happened to many thousands of men and women since 1935, but it seemed like a miracle to a kid. Only that isn't the right place either, because I don't think my father would have needed a miracle if it hadn't been for that goddamned bridge. So that's where I need to start. With the goddamned Sycamore Street Bridge.
I really like him. Like I said, interested now. I'm going to check out some more of their audiobooks. But hopefully that was fine. Like I say, when I'm recording, of course, I can't respond to it because I've only just done it. So it's not really clear for me to whether it was fine or not. But hopefully it was interesting for people. And that is Stephen King's Fairy Tale. I think that released last year. I've just not got around to reading it yet. I'm like most people, collect books, got a big collection. And the intention is, of course, to read, but we need to find a time to get these processed. And that's really what I intend to do at some point, really just finish everything. But of course, I don't think that's possible for anyone.